Hello, everyone. Welcome. This program on the Black presence in Tudor England will explore the lives and experiences of John Blanke, a trumpeter in the courts of Henry VII and Henry VIII, and of other documented free Black residents of Tudor England. We're grateful that this program has been made possible by Denise. Thank you. I'm delighted to introduce our two esteemed speakers. Dr. Miranda Kaufmann is the author of the book Black Tudors, The Untold Story, which was published in 2017 and shortlisted for the Wolfson History Prize. Dr. Kaufmann read history at Christ Church, Oxford. She is an honorary fellow of the University of Liverpool, a fellow of the Royal History Society, and the Royal Society of the Arts. She's currently a senior research fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies in London and is working on her second book, Heiresses, The Caribbean Marriage Trade, as well as her Teaching Black Tudors project in British schools. Michael Ohajuru is a senior fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies in London and a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. He speaks regularly on the Black presence in Renaissance Europe and holds honors degrees in physics and art history. Mr. Ohajuru is the founder of the Image of the Black in London Galleries tour series and a founder member of the Black Presence in British Portraiture Network. He is the director of the John Blanke Project. Michael and Miranda are both co-conveners of the Institute of Commonwealth Studies workshops, What's Happening in Black British History. Please join me in welcoming Michael and Miranda.
Thank you for that introduction, Denise. Does the sound okay? Great. And I want to thank the Met for inviting me here to share my passion, John Blanke, in particular, the Black presence in Renaissance England. We're starting off with John Blanke because he really is the poster boy of the Black Tudors. He's in book covers, magazines, the covers of magazines, countless articles in magazines, on the BBC. He's even appeared on the 6 o'clock news. Such is his fame and celebrity. For me, a truly outstanding character. And hopefully by the end of this evening, you will share my passion too. I'm going to tell you a bit about where he comes from. This is where he comes from, this document, the Great Tournament Roll of Westminster. This is a truly outstanding document, a Tudor document, because it was commissioned by Henry VIII to celebrate a joust, which celebrated his son, born that year on New Year's Day that year, 1511. And he wanted to show the world how great his court was. And here we have the document. It's 60 foot long, and it's held at the College of Arms. And it really travels. Not explicit, really. It very rarely travels. And I had the pleasure of seeing it with Miranda a couple of years ago. And it's, as I say, it's 60 foot long, about 15 inches wide, and it covers the 2 days of the joust. And John Blanke appears twice. He appears in the opening ceremony, and he's part of the troupe of trumpeters. And the trumpets in the Tudor court were almost like, I call them the punctuation of the court. Here comes the king, trumpets. There goes the king, trumpets. Breakfast, dinner, the trumpet was really or fanfares really the order of the day. And John Blanke was a key member of the trumpeting troupe at the Tudor court. And here he leads the procession of Henry's court at the start of the joust. His second appearance is at the end of the joust as he leads the king in. And guess who won the joust? Henry VIII. It's great to be the king. It's great to be the king. And we have this. This is the College of Arms' most sought after most requested image of John Blanke, because it really is truly outstanding in terms of the quality, because it was never looked at, because once a few weeks after the tournament finished, the baby died. So there was no real interest in this document. So it's literally been locked up for almost 500 years in the College of Arms. So this is what makes John Blanke so real. These vivid images of him that we know he existed, not just from those pictures, but also from the record. And this is his record from the Tudor court accounts, and the tantalizingly fleeting. Here, this is his first entry, 1507. He was paid 8 pence, and that's about 20 shillings a month. And that's a fairly good wage, because we reckon it's about the work of, not the work, or twice what an agricultural worker would have earned, or about 3 times what a servant would have earned. And when you keep in mind the fact that when he was in court, or in the palace or the castle where the king was, he didn't pay for his food or his lodging. So he was quite well off in terms of money, compared with other people, with other working people. And he played the Henry VII's funeral, and he played at the coronation of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. And he petitioned, we don't know when, but it's documented, we have the document, he petitioned Henry for a wage increase. Because one of the trumpeters has died, and he was doing the same job as him. And he said, look, I should be paid the same. And it was more than that, he actually wanted backdated. So he got a pay increase, and it got it backdated. And the way we interpret that now, because he probably couldn't write. He dictated that to a scribe. And there's the standard text at the start where the king is important and he wants the king live forever. And the finish is all, may the king rule and reign forever. But the central text that we believe is his. And there's a certain confidence. Not quite arrogance, but there's a confidence in knowing who he is and the value that the king that actually brings to the king, and it's signed. So he actually got the paid award, and then the last record. Oh, sorry. Then he appears at the tournament run. We'll come back to that later. But then he was married, January 1512. Really exciting, and the idea of him being married. The sad thing is we don't know who. We don't know who to. And this is what makes him so intriguing, because when you think we've got these 2 images of him, and he's the only black Tudor that we have an image of, and that was, when you couple that with his record, that's what makes him so exciting, so intriguing. Intriguing in the sense that we know these fleeting things about he was paid, and he appeared at a number of court events, he petitioned, and he's married. But where did he come from? That name John Blanke, what's that all about? And he's wearing a turban there, whereas the other people are bareheaded. What's that about? There's so many questions that we don't know that challenge us about John Blanke. That was my kind of big introduction to him in terms of what we don't know and trying to understand that. So when you couple that with those 2 images, that little bit, maybe we can kind of imagine the rest. We can fill in, and it's a really poor joke, so I'll tell it from. We can fill in the blanks, if you stay with a very poor joke. I've got John Agard, the poet, to thank for that, and we'll talk about him later. But sadly, he disappears from the record in 1514 when we have the list of trumpeters. So we don't know where he went. And so he's, in many ways, he's a man of mystery, but equally a man of opportunity. And he, as I say, today is the poster boy. But he's not just the only black Tudor. There are many more, and I'm going to invite my friend and colleague, Miranda, to tell you more about the other black Tudors.
Hi, everyone. It's just such a pleasure to be here with my lovely friend Michael. We've been working on this stuff together for 10 years, so what better way to celebrate our 10th anniversary than here at the Met? So thank you so much for having us. So much as I love John Blanke, I devoted the first chapter of my book to him. He was not the only African in Tudor England by any means. And myself and other scholars have researched this in depth recently, and there is now evidence of over 200 people of African descent living in Tudor England. And they were not just in London and at the court like John Blanke, they were actually across the country, everywhere from Hull to Truro. About a third of them are in London, but there are also fairly large concentrations in southern port towns like Southampton, Plymouth and Bristol. But they weren't even just in towns, they were in quite remote rural areas like Bluntisham-cum-Erith. I've pronounced that wrong, I know. Bluntisham-cum-Erith in Cambridge. Someone corrected me on Instagram after I mentioned this on the radio. They said I'd pronounced somebody who lived in Bluntisham-cum-Erith. That's the joy of social media. She contacted me and I said, and I meant to look up how to pronounce it. I will do that next time. Anyway, so this is a record of a burial of a woman called Dido in Bluntisham-cum-Erith. And a lot of the records we have of Black Tudors come from these parish registers, and they can be quite frustrating because we don't have lovely pictures of them like of John Blanke. They're these one-liners, just these tiny fragments of biographical information. And that's equally true of white Tudors. Like most people in Tudor England, we do not have portraits, we do not have extensive records. But we can see from these parish registers how people of African descent were integrated into Tudor society. They are being baptized, married, and buried. And sometimes, there are a small minority, so the baptisms show children that were born to black and white parents, and there are some records of interracial marriages as well, like this one. John Comey married Perrinal May in 1602. John Comey isn't referenced as being black in this particular record, but he is in other records, so we can put that together. And actually, well, no, I won't say that. Anyway, so they also, well, I could do, well, now I'm going to say. So Fortunatus, a blackamoor of the age of 17 or 18 years. So there were quite a lot of adult baptisms, which is an interesting point as well. But Fortunatus was actually a servant to the Cecil family, who I'll mention again later, but they were a key family at the Elizabethan court. And so these parish registers can also tell us something about occupations, because Africans do appear in the royal household, like John Blanke. They appear in the households of aristocrats, but they also, that's really a minority of them. They also appear in merchants' households as domestic servants, but also in quite lowly households like that of a seamstress or a beer brewer. And then there are some who we can see are financially independent craftsmen, like there's this needle maker in Cheapside in the 1550s who has this exclusive knowledge of, he's imported Spanish silver needles into, steel, not silver. Imagine how expensive a silver needle would be. That would be more like what Elizabeth I would be using for her own embroidery, wouldn't it? No, steel needles, Spanish steel, which was a new innovation, but he would not teach his art to any, so he had a monopoly there. And we also know of a silk weaver with the wonderful name Reasonable Blackman, and other skilled individuals. There were quite a few black sailors in Tudor England. So there are people who are not even domestic servants who are earning their living independently. But the exhibition that we're going to enjoy touring you around later this evening is focused on that Tudor court world. So the rest of my remarks now are going to focus in on that. And you're going to see these wonderful images of Henry VII and Henry VIII in a minute if you haven't already seen them. So, John Blanke served both of those kings, but he was not the only African in the royal entourage in the Tudor period. In much the same way that John Blanke came to England, we think in the entourage of Catherine of Aragon, who also had a black maidservant called Catalina of Murrell. We know that when Philip II came from Spain, again, to marry Mary I, he had an African in his entourage, and we know that because of this record from a London cloth merchant's diary, where he says that in November 1554, there was a fight broke out between the Spanish and the English, because the English weren't that thrilled with these Spaniards showing up at this point. And one of the instigators, they think, was this Blackmore, and so he was involved in that. So that's how we know that he came with Philip II. And we also have this record that shows that Elizabeth I had an African servant in the 1570s because she bought this gorgeous clothing for him. But it's not just in the royal household. A lot of Elizabeth courtiers also had African servants. So this is Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. The picture on the right is in the exhibition. And we know from his household accounts that he had an African servant because you can see here, gave the Blackamoor a 5-shilling reward in 1584 and had also bought him a mattress the year before. And I love this is a very useful footnote because it not only mentions the mattress record, but it also says, cross-reference Raleigh's Blackamoor, page 210. So handily, the Leicester records also show us that Walter Raleigh had an African in his household at this time. And there are other references to Africans in the Raleigh household, particularly serving his wife Bess Throckmorton as well. And in fact, all of these courtiers and noblemen had Africans in their households. We've got, I mentioned Fortunatus. He worked for William Cecil, far left, and his son was Sir Robert Cecil. William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, was Elizabeth I's sort of de facto prime minister for a lot of her reign. And then when he died, his son sort of took over. That's the Henry Percy, 9th Duke of Northumberland, and Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh. And why did they have them? Well, a lot of these people, what they had in common is that they were this crazy table is called the Sea Dogs table. Well, these guys were called Sea Dogs as well because some of them, all of the people in this slide, personally pursued privateering voyages. Privateering is essentially piracy with the Queen's consent. So it was a kind of Cold War against Spain of attacking them at sea but without declaring a full war. And because the Spanish and the Portuguese had been trafficking enslaved Africans across the Atlantic since the early 16th century, when they captured Spanish or Portuguese ships at sea, they quite often had Africans on board. And equally, if they raided Spanish ports in the Atlantic world, the same applied. And just one example of that, if you look at Drake, you might have noticed the jewel I started with. He's wearing this jewel around his waist. And like some of the jewels in the exhibition, it also had a miniature of Elizabeth I in it. But I'm much more interested in the image on the left because it opens up this story of Francis Drake and how Francis Drake brought several Africans to England in this period. So the jewel was a gift to Drake from Elizabeth I, and several scholars, myself included, have argued that image is actually symbolic of an alliance between Africans and English against the Spaniards, because when Francis Drake attacked Panama, which was a Spanish colony at that point, in 1572, he actually allied with these people called the Cimarrones, who were Africans who'd been enslaved by the Spaniards but had run away and established their own settlements in the hinterland. And they had been attacking the Spaniards there for years. But when Drake showed up, he kind of piggybacked on that, and together they captured a huge amount of this sort of stuff, gold and silver, huge fortune that actually, when Drake brought that home, it founded his fortune and his relationship with the Queen, because she got some of the gold and did this sort of thing with it. So it's always the best way to the Queen's affections to come back with a whole load of gold and silver. But Drake carried on. I was going to say that the founder of that alliance, Drake didn't just kind of ride into the Cimarroon settlement going, "Hi guys," there was this man called Diego, who's central to this story, who actually brokered it, and he had been enslaved in a Spanish household in Nombre de Dios in Panama, but he basically forced his way onto Drake's ship and to escape from enslavement, but also what he brought to Drake and said, "Look, I can get you in touch with these Cimarroons, and that will make your fortune." And Diego goes back to Plymouth with Drake after this adventure, lives in his household in Plymouth, which is in Devon in the south of England, for 4 years, and then joins him on that circumnavigation of the globe that Drake becomes so famous for. And unfortunately dies as a result of arrow wounds sustained off the coast of Chile, although he manages to survive for another year. So he doesn't come back. But Drake does continue to bring more Africans to England, for example, on this raid of the Caribbean. And for the, it might be interesting. So he attacks all these Spanish settlements here, places like Cartagena, and they actually call it Roanoke on the way home. They've got several Africans on board, but there's a huge storm shortly after they get to Roanoke, and I think several of the Africans as well as the English aboard died in that storm, so which is why there are not as many Africans coming back to England as the Spaniards record had fled to join Drake's ships on this voyage. But one of them that I did find is Edward Swarthy. Now this is probably one of the most exciting stories I found in my research. And one of the ship's captains on this raid was a man called Sir Edward Winter. And 10 years later, we find this deposition of Edward Swarthy in the court records of the Star Chamber. And it says Edward Swarthy was a servant to Sir Edward Winter. And in this document, he testifies. And this is another example of how we know that Africans were free in Tudor England, because enslaved people weren't allowed to testify in court in this time. So the fact that he was allowed to testify. But the story he's telling is that on his master's orders, he whipped a white servant in that household to punish him for a slight against his master. And I find this story so fascinating because it inverts our assumptions about the roles of African in the British past. When I first tried to read that, I mean, you can imagine, when I first tried to read that, the word whip jumped out, and I assumed it was the African was being whipped, but it turned out he was the one doing the whipping. And in a kind of really strange twist of fate, the man that he whipped, who had been quite a high-ranking servant, actually goes on to become the first colonial governor of Newfoundland. And this is him meeting the... So I think that Americans... often sort of view black history starting in 1619, and that those first encounters between the English and Africans happening in Virginia in 1619. But in fact, this research shows that those encounters have been happening for over a century beforehand, and some of those early colonists of America knew and sometimes lived alongside Africans in England before they came here, which I think raises a lot of interesting questions about race relations going forward, and how they then evolve in America. And I get frustrated when our popular culture is saturated with images like this that kind of dominate our ideas about Africans in the European past, and we assume that all the time when I tell people that I've been researching Black Tudors, they're like, "Oh, you mean slaves?" All the time. Like 70% of people, that is their response. But actually, I think we need to think about images like this. This man ruled Florence briefly before he got assassinated, which was pretty normal, standard amongst the Medici at the time. His mother was an African woman. This is Alessandra de' Medici. We don't know who these people were, but they clearly were not enslaved. They're Italy, Netherlands. And I just wish that there were portraits of all of the people in my book, which I think you can see from their occupations. You can see the kind of wide range of things Africans were doing in Tudor England. And yeah, I wish there were portraits of all of them, which is why I'm so thrilled about the Michael's John Blanke project, which is creating loads of wonderful portraits. Thank you.
You can see there where I was talking about John Blanke, the poster boy, the cover of Miranda's book, really exciting image. But my project is about taking those images further, the idea of John Blanke, making us try and understand or feel a bit more about who he is and what he did, and perhaps what he means to us. And so the project is really, as I say, to imagine the Black Tudor. And I see it as an art and archive project. That's what the critical thing, that we bring the art and archives together. We look deeper into the archives and think more about them, and we try and translate that into some art. And there's 93, let me get this right, there's 93 plus contributions to the project. These are people I've individually commissioned to do either in the case of historians, to write a piece up to about 300 words, and those pieces are all online now about John Blanke. I'm really pleased, so pleased. We've got Paul Kaplan, Professor Paul Kaplan in the audience tonight. He's done a piece for him for the project. He talks about where did that name John Blanke come from. And he talks about John Blanke being known in Spain. There's John Blankes in France and Italy, and it's just rich. It helps us kind of understand more about John Blanke, the little bit of knowledge that we know about him. As I say, there's about 30 historian pieces, but there's 60 plus artistic responses. Mostly visual, but there's rap, there's poetry, there's some textiles, there's a mosaic, or people trying to understand the John Blanke image, an idea. And I want to share some of them with you now. None of the work is online. That was important for me, because I wanted this to be a body of work. You'd see it collectively, and then trying to understand who John Blanke was. And so you'll see the artists were invited to make a statement of about 60 to 100 words, but they had to start with, "I imagine John Blanke as." So they've given it some thought. I'm not going to share all 30 with you, not all 60, but I'll share a couple. And I've got to stress, this is important, these are not my favorites. None of them are my favorites. I love them all, because I really want to respect the artists who have commissioned. I value their work, and I'm not going to praise one above the other. This is the late John Daniels, a brilliant man. He's passed away 50, far too young. But he saw John Blanke as a trump card. Or then we've got Alvin Kofi, a portrait artist, and he imagined John as a learned man with a great awareness of the world. What I find exciting about Alvin's work here, he actually has tribal markings on his John Blanke, really rooting him in Africa and surrounding him with African symbolism. A really an outstanding imaginative image. And then this is Sharon Foster. This is she sort of was a strong, charismatic, creative black man, and the model of this was her own son. She has the Adinkra symbols of the underlining those attributes on his shoulders, so underlining the strength of character that she saw in John Blanke. This is a particularly interesting one. This is there are a number of for want of a better word, abstract responses. This is Lynette Camilla. Her practice is calligraffiti. That's her style. She's made that her own. And then she talks about, she imagined John Blanke as a courageous and resilient and creative who chose the timeless meaning of graffiti to capture his presence. So he's left his mark on society. So what I wanted to do there was just to give you a feeling for the artistic response, the contemporary artistic response to John Blanke. This is a shot of an exhibition that we just had in Liverpool a couple of months ago, finished a couple of months ago. We had the collection on show, and I was really particularly proud of, because individually the pictures, they're good. But when they come together, they have a presence of their own. Quantity has a quality all of its own, and you see it there when you look at the work and compare how people imagine John Blanke, the attributes that they has, make him a really compelling character. And the project goes forward. Where I do workshops. We've done them in schools, universities, and in prisons, where we get when I tell them the story of John Blanke that I shared with you earlier, and then I get them to draw their John Blanke and make a statement. I imagine John Blanke. We have symposium. These are evenings of John Blanke, where the historians come and talk about their understanding of John Blanke, and the artists come and present their work, how they imagine John Blanke. So it's a work in progress, and hopefully you'll have a chance to see it someday. But in the meantime, if you check out johnblanke.com, you'll get a sense of the exhibition. Thank you.